Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting into Secret Wars 2. Here's the cool thing. This story is only 9 issues long, and technically we can cover it in 2 parts, right? It's nowhere near as complex as Secret Wars 1. The interesting thing about this is depending on who you talk to, some people will say they hated Secret Wars 2. Other people will say it was amazing. It sold pretty well from what I understand, so I enjoyed it. Like, I enjoyed the second half of it. The first half is kind of like, all right. But the second half is when you get like the cosmic entities and all that kind of crazy stuff, which gets really, really cool. But nonetheless, picking up with this, again, this really kind of comes hot off the heels, not immediately, but it comes off the heels of the first Secret Wars comic, right? So we're talking about the idea that at the end of the first Secret Wars, the idea of the Beyonder was never fully reconciled in the sense that we never really knew what it was. We simply just knew it was just this entity that was like, I am from beyond, and that was basically it. But because the story sold so well, indicating people liked it, otherwise people wouldn't have bought it because, you know, people don't buy stories they don't like. The result is that Marvel continued this on into a second comic. Now this one really picks up with Owen Reese and Marcia. Now for those of you guys who saw Secret Wars 1, you'll recall those two, right? They kind of had that story really focused on their relationship, and ultimately Owen Reese ended up moving in with Marcia in Denver, Colorado, right? So they're just kind of relaxing and chilling and doing their thing when there's like this huge, you know, kind of explosion sound from off in the distance. Now the funny thing about this is that, you know, Owen Reese is like, I don't know, maybe it was a truck that backfired or something like that. And it's like, okay, look, Owen, if that was a truck that backfired, it's either the biggest truck in the history of the world or it exploded, because like it's pretty far away and it's a pretty loud noise. But at that point, the entire TV starts going on the fritz. The signal's lost, all kinds of crazy things are going on. And when they stick their head out and they start looking at what's going on, suddenly like all these trees and huge chunks of rocks and everything are all flying in a direction. Now Marcia's able to destroy one of the boulders, but in response, Owen Reese of course uses his powers to kind of, you know, really kind of seem to try to control the situation. But what he ends up realizing is that on one of these chunks of rock is a guy out there, right? Just some guy sitting on this rock. And Owen Reese begins to pick up on the energy signature and realizes it's the Beyonder. Now, when that happens, we immediately switch over to Charles Xavier. Now, there's a couple things that I want to talk about here, and really one big thing that I want to discuss. The first thing is that this comes before Uncanny X-Men issue number 200, right? So at this point in time, Charles Xavier is still here on Earth, and Magneto has not taken over leadership of the X-Men or the New Mutants, but he's on his way to taking over that role. And that's the reason why when you actually see Magneto in this story, he'll have that outfit with a great big huge M on it, and it'll look like the cover of Uncanny X-Men where he's standing there in handcuffs on his hands and on his feet, where he's basically going to stand trial, right? The Trial of Magneto is what that story was called. That's why it looks so familiar here. But the other part of this is that on the X-Men roster is Rachel Summers. Now, the idea of Rachel Summers, for those of you guys who are familiar with her character, bear with me for a second. This is not a huge talking point, but she is going to be more or less the field commander of the team, at least in this particular instance, given the power that she possesses. But the reason why this matters is Rachel Summers made her debut in Days of Future Past, right? You guys have all pretty much heard of that story. And she was essentially the only instance in any alternate reality where we've ever seen Scott Summers or Cyclops and Jean Grey have a child, and it turned out to be a girl, right? In every other alternate reality, it's a guy. It's basically Nate Grey or Nate Summers, whatever you want to call him. Rachel's the only exception to that, at least that I know of. The result is that during Days of Future Past, of course, she sent the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past to stop the assassination of Charles Xavier, Maura McTaggart, and Senator Robert Kelly in order to prevent Days of Future Past from happening. The result is that it didn't quite work out that way. And so what ended up happening is that while Days of Future Past was stopped, the future that Rachel came from became an alternate reality. And so what she ended up doing was basically traveling back into the past and really kind of arriving in the modern day. Now, this takes place in a few different stories. It's really kind of spread over Days of Future Present from the 1990s, Excalibur number 52, and Uncanny X-Men number 199. Now, Uncanny X-Men 199 is really where it's kind of like here she is now, but the idea is that she kind of has a fraction of the Phoenix Force's powers, which she attained from the Days of Future Past timeline, right? She basically got it from that point and then jumped back to the modern day, but that's why she's essentially here now. Right now, Days of Future Present focuses more on Franklin, that alternate reality, or I guess really the spiritual essence of Franklin Richards from Days of Future Past showing up, and then, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff happening. But that's more or less how Rachel gets here. But over the course of those 3 stories and some ancillary stories in between, it's all kind of fleshed out, right? But that's basically why she's here. You can kind of take that and run with it, you know, and just sort of go with it. But at the end of the day, what Xavier does before he kind of passes out from the mental strain is basically send this kind of telepathic message out to a whole bunch of the different Avengers, right? Captain America, Magneto, a few others, you know, basically say the Beyonder is back now, right? The Beyonder has arrived here on Earth and he's in Western America. Now, from that point, it basically switches back over to Owen. And this is where things get kind of cool, is because when the Beyonder arrives here, he's actually an amalgamation of a bunch of different characters, right? He's an amalgamation of kind of like Ben Grimm and Dr. Doom and Cyclops and Ulysses Claw and so on and so forth. And he basically just, like, he literally looks like a 1980s wrestler, more or less, like the WWF in the 1980s, like, here comes the Beyonder with Dink and Doink, you know, who's gonna win the match, you know? But that's kind of how it looks. But notice this, any semblance of humanity is essentially removed. Now, that's something that I want you to focus on, because that was one of the cool aspects of Secret Wars 2, is the Beyonder progressively becomes more human over the course of the story. But all he basically says is, I desire to understand. Now, Owen Reese is aware of who the Beyonder is, right? Like what he's capable of. So he doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation here. But the overall reason for why the Beyonder is doing this, or why he's here, is because, remember, like in the first Secret Wars, he looked at humanity, right? He looked at the overall gist of humanity and basically said that there is essentially incompleteness there. Now, this incompleteness is a result of people, right? Like the nature of human beings, in the sense that in the Beyondiverse, at the time this story was written, the Beyonder was essentially his entire universe, right? So there was nothing but him. Whereas here, you've got all different kinds of organisms and people and races and things like that. You've got political conflicts and you've got differing ideologies and so on and so forth. But everybody's looking to understand the meaning of life, which is really what the Beyonder's asking here. And so the result is that Owen's like, man, I can't really answer that question. I can't really answer the question of what the meaning of life is. Instead, he gives him a little bit of guidance, and it's really more to just kind of get him out of his hair. And he's like, the only way to really understand the meaning of life is to gain experience, to go out there and experience things and then kind of figure it out for yourself, right? And to a degree, that's true, right? You know, confidence comes with experience. Understanding the world comes with experience, but you've got to get out there, you got to try things, and you got to see what kind of works for you, what doesn't, and then just go from there. And so with the Beyonder basically taking off, of course, Marcia asked the question, is everything going to be okay? And Owen's like, yeah, man, he'll be fine. He's just some omnipotent being that doesn't understand humanity, and he's just kind of floating out there in the world. What's the worst that could happen? But from there, you basically pick up with the X-Men more or less meeting up with Magneto. Right now, this is kind of a skirmish that sort of pops off. It's not a great big huge thing. It's like one page, more or less. But essentially, Colossus comes to the rescue and is like, hey, look, Magneto's here to talk, right? He's here to talk to us. He's not really here to initiate a conflict or anything like that. Everything's cool. Chill out, guys. Like, it's all going to be all right. And so, of course, they end up grabbing a vehicle and then traveling out to Hollywood where the Beyonder resides. Now, one thing to understand is that Rachel Summers is kind of the connection there, right? She can pick up on where the Beyonder's at because of her telepathic powers, but she's by no means on par with the Beyonder, right? She doesn't really have the same kind of power that he does. Instead, what you end up getting is basically the Beyonder showing up in Los Angeles and then coming across a guy by the name of Stuart Cadwell. Now, this is kind of important here because the Beyonder doesn't really understand the notion of good and evil, right? He doesn't really understand what good is, what evil is. He doesn't understand human desire. He doesn't understand things like being taken advantage of or anything along those lines. And so when he basically displays his power to Stuart and turning like his office and everything into like just a whole bunch of apples, or at least his desk and everything into a whole bunch of apples, then in turn, Stuart picks up on the idea of this guy can do anything. So he basically says, give me a fraction of your power, and then we'll kind of go from there. And so what ends up happening is the Beyonder bestows a fraction of his power onto Stuart, and Stuart goes forward as like this guy named Thundersword. Now, this is where things get a little murky, because you would think that the Beyonder would have learned his lesson from the first Secret Wars, bestowing his power onto somebody and how awful it can go awry. We've kind of seen how that can play out and how negative that can be, especially with Dr. Doom having stolen his power in the first place. So it looks like the Beyonder hasn't learned anything from his first experience with humanity in the various superheroes. But what this ends up doing is it basically leads to Stuart kind of going forward as Thunderlord and trying to like make the world a better place, but ultimately causing more problems than anything else, attacking various places and any ideology that he doesn't agree with, he ends up attacking, right? So it's like Twitter basically. And the result is that when this happens, of course, the X-Men who are hot on the trail of the Beyonder stumble across this great big huge conflict and then basically try to track down Thunderlord and defeat him. And at the same time, the Avengers respond as well. So it's not particularly interesting and it's not really fascinating. What is kind of important here is what goes on behind the scenes. And this will be a common theme that you will see with regards to the first, really this video, is like something will be happening and then the Beyonder will just pop up. And the reason for that is because unlike the first Secret Wars, which was entirely self-contained, it was just a 12-issue limited series and you didn't really have to read anything else because it took place out in space on Battleworld. With Secret Wars 2, it actually ties into ongoing comics, right? And we'll talk about that, as we kind of get through this. We won't go into the individual comics themselves, but we'll kind of talk about that to a degree. But what ends up happening is that while Thunderlord's kind of running amok and doing his whole thing, you basically have the Beyonder who appears to Rachel Summers and then to Illyana Rasputin. And when he does, he basically takes the Dark Child concept of Illyana Rasputin, where she gives in to this kind of inner evil and then just grabs her, like literally seizes her, forces the Dark Child personality to manifest, and then in turn, the Dark Child whisks them away to limbo, right? So it's kind of a way to sort of remove the X-Men temporarily to kind of follow up in their own individual comic. And then of course they end up returning here, but Wolverine basically lashes out, kind of goes into a berserker rage, believing that the Beyonder had basically killed them. And when that happens, what ends up going on is the Beyonder, of course, slashed all to pieces and bleeding all over the place, is perfectly fine. And then basically the X-Men are just kind of made to vanish, right? They're just sort of like, okay, you're out of here. Now understand, the Beyonder is not doing this because it's like, I feel like doing evil things because I saw a really mean TV show and I'm just copying what I saw. That's not the case. For him, he's just doing things, right? Like for him, it's no different than breathing or anything like that. But what he's doing is experimenting and learning. That's essentially what's happening here, right? So it's no different than a baby coming to the realization that if it cries, it will get attention. The baby can't say, my diaper needs to be changed. The baby just cries and then the parents come to it and then basically, you know, solve whatever's ailing that baby at that point in time. And so of course, Thunderlord is more or less taken out, you know, pretty quickly in the sense that it's like, okay, you know, his powers are basically drained and the Molecule Man just sort of leaves him there and walks away. But in response to that, where he sort of vanishes, you know, Captain America tries to confront him and he kind of vanishes. Instead, kind of facsimile of the Beyonder in an invisible form follows Captain America around just to see what's going on. But at the same time, he also teleports his main self directly to the city of New York and then actually ends up in San Francisco and then just starts looking around and like taking a look at people and just sort of seeing what's going on. And what you get is this sort of run over about different things that are taking place in the various comics, right? Like this coincides around within about a month or two of Fantastic Four issue number 280. For those of you guys who understand that, who know that reference, you get the significance of it. For those of you guys who don't, that's basically the beginning of the Malice saga where Susan Storm becomes Malice. It's about 3 or 4 issues long, but she becomes like this totally evil version of herself, more or less. But what's also going on here, and this is kind of an on-running theme in the Fantastic Four stories up to this point, is you basically have Psycho Man. Now, Psycho Man's not particularly important. He's not very interesting at all. He's a character that's been around for a long time, right? Since about 1967, and he actually comes from the microverse, right? The microscopic universe inside the main Marvel universe. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they call it the Quantum Realm, is basically what it is, but it's all essentially the same thing. They call it that because Marvel doesn't have the legal rights to use the microverse outside of the comics, as far as I'm aware. But essentially, Psycho Man, and then you also got Hate Monger. It's weird. They're basically kind of going through and just instilling hate. You know, every place they go, manipulating the emotions of people and driving them into conflict against superheroes. But ultimately, you end up having Psycho Man, or I guess really Hate Monger and Psycho Man, using their machinations to turn Susan Storm into Malice, and that kind of continues on in the actual Fantastic Four 280 to 283. But what you also have going on here is somebody grabs a brick, throws it through the window of a department building, and the Beyonder walks in. And as this guy walks up, and it's just like, did you throw the brick through the window? And you know, why are you breaking in here? The response of the Beyonder is, I just desire to learn, right? I just desire to understand. And so the guy's like, look, I don't know who you are or what's going on, but it's kind of weird that you're dressed all in white with no shoes on, but maybe you should go find a friend. And so at the end of the day, the Beyonder's like, okay, yes, I will do that. I will go find a friend. And then ultimately seeks out Peter Parker. Now, Peter Parker doesn't realize it's the Beyonder, and the Beyonder doesn't tell him who he is. Now, it's really more because of the fact that it doesn't dawn on him to introduce himself. He's just kind of like, I am from beyond, you know, or something along those lines. But ultimately, it gets kind of crazy because the Beyonder looks at Peter Parker and sees that when he's just Peter, that people just kind of treat him like a normal person. But when he puts on the Spider-Man costume, suddenly everybody's like, oh my God, it's Spider-Man. And so he starts asking things like, you know, why do people eat? You know, why do people do these kinds of things, right? Having watched what people do, watched how they interact in their everyday lives, it's why do people eat? Like, why do people sleep? Like, why do people desire things? Like why do you do what you do, right? Just wholly new to humanity with no real clue here. And the response of Peter is, man, I don't really know. I mean, we do it just because we do it, you know, but like people respond to me differently when I'm Spider-Man because one, they don't know I'm Spider-Man, and two, Spider-Man is a hero and they kind of cherish that. But at the same time, he's like, look, if what you're looking to understand is essentially the meaning of life and all that, you need to go talk to Reed Richards, right? Because he's super smart. And around that time, the Beyonder has to go to the bathroom for the first time. So Peter Parker's like, just go right in there, man. Just don't blow it up. Make sure you spray, dude. And so at that moment, what you do is you basically switch over to the Fantastic Four, kind of in the midst of this whole conflict, or really kind of the aftermath of this conflict with Malice. And then in turn, like, you know, the Beyonder shows up to Reed Richards and it's just kind of like, you know, I desire to understand things. Like, I desire to know things. Now, Reed doesn't really panic the way you would expect him to, right? You kind of look at Reed and you're kind of like, okay, so this guy would be like, oh my God, the Beyonder's here, you know, and kind of start to freak out. But having more or less been warned of what was coming by Captain America and so on, then he basically says, okay, you know, I would love to teach you and explain to you, but I don't know if I can fully explain like the intricacies of the universe to you. And so the Beyonder's like, okay, that's enough, gone. And then basically takes off. You know, he basically ends up bailing out. From that point, he ends up, you know, coming across some kind of a suit inside a department store and basically takes the suit, puts it on himself, and then he runs into an old homeless woman. And this is one of the coolest things, right? Because she's just sort of like, okay, look, you can't steal stuff from people like that. So she kind of starts to provide these sort of societal guidelines on what a person can and can't do. And then two, she's kind of like, if you're going to do this, like, you got to make yourself look presentable, right? I mean, you got got to wear shoes and different things along those lines, you know. And it's kind of funny because he's like, well, why do people do what they do? Like how do things work here? And she basically says like money is essentially the one thing that matters most in this world, right? It's the one thing that people prize above pretty much everything else, and it's what makes the world go round, right? Like the only way you can really get anywhere in this world is to have money, right? And then he kind of asked the question, like, you know, the small little creatures, you know, who share your clothing, do they pay for their shelter? She's like, what, the bugs? No, they don't pay for shelter. The flies are free. But it's kind of crazy because what the Beyonder experiences for the first time is being mugged, right? You know, there's these guys that show up that basically think that he's super wealthy, and instead of helping them understand their place in the bigger picture or like wiping them out of existence or something like that, he's just kind of like, you know, for him it doesn't really matter, right? Because I mean, he's super omnipotent, insanely powerful, he fixes itself like that, you know, and that's basically it. But then from there, she basically pulls out a card and says, here's Heroes for Hire, you should go look into them, you know, maybe they can give you some kind of experience or something like that. And of course he ends up jumping there. Now, this is when you start to get these interesting displays of the Beyonder's power, right? Because it's one thing to heal yourself. We see Wolverine do that all the time. We see Deadpool do that. Not at the time this story is written, Deadpool doesn't exist, but once he does pop up, you see Deadpool heal himself. You see that kind of thing all the time. One of the cool displays that goes on here is that when he shows up in the office of Heroes for Hire, he realizes that Luke Cage and Iron Fist were here, but they're currently not here right now. So what he does is he snatches them out of time and brings them to this current location. And then a fight breaks out. Luke Cage is like, I'm gonna kill this man. Like, I'm gonna beat this man within an inch of his life. You know, and they both, you know, kind of get into a conflict with each other. But Danny Rand ends up being the one to kind of jump in and try to talk reason here. But it's a funny thing because Danny Rand's like, look, man, if you're looking for experience, man, like I can help you kind of get the experience you're looking for. I can direct you where you need to go. Essentially just kind of like, go get yourself a girl, man, and you'll experience a lot if you do that. But ultimately, Luke Cage is one that kind of comes in and says the same thing that the old homeless woman said. Money is what matters in this world. Money is what gets you the services of Heroes for Hire. Money is what gets you a place to live. It's what gets you food, all that kind of stuff. Somebody's always got to pay, right? That's kind of the way that works. And so ultimately, the Beyonder walks up to the building of Luke Cage and one of the coolest displays of power, and then rematerializes the whole thing and turns the whole building into gold. Now, of course, it ends up collapsing under its own weight, but it's a cool sight to see. The Beyonder's like, I had your services, you helped me with something, therefore I have to pay. So I turn this building into gold, right? Again, just kind of doing things that seem to be arbitrary. I understand this is how the world is supposed to work, therefore I'm going to conduct myself in this way. And so what you end up doing is running into probably one of the more interesting aspects of the story when the Beyonder gets hookers, right? Because what he ends up doing is making his way, you know, down the road and then comes across this one hooker who's just kind of standing there. And like, she's just sort of like, hey, like, are you looking for some kind of company or something like that? But he's like, I mean, I guess, you know, like I am from beyond, you know, I guess that's what I'm looking for. Like, I just seek to understand. And so she's like, well, you got to give us some money first. So he produces a bar of gold in his hand. And then she kind of freaks out, right? She's like, dude, there's no way that's real. That's got to be fake. And so she's like, you need to go to like some kind of hotel and just chill, right? So he ends up going to like this super seedy hotel, right? Like the seediest of seedy hotels. And then when that happens, like he's basically confronted by Tootsie, who is this chick, by Toots is what they refer to her as, by her pimp, and then the guy who runs the whole show. And what he basically says is, hey, look, man, like our friend introduced us and showed us this bar of gold that you created. So like, let's talk. You know, let's talk and let's converse and let's hang out with each other. And so basically this guy, Mr. Corbeau, leaves a Beyonder in the presence of Toots, you know, basically this hooker. And then the next morning she takes him around town and starts to show him all these different things, right? To help him understand what it means to eat, right? To understand food, different things like that, why people do what they do. And it's kind of funny because he initially goes to get a drink and just goes to eat the whole thing. And she's like, no, don't do that. Like whatever you eat, just like eat the food off the fork, but don't eat the fork. The funny thing is that Corbeau comes along and brings like a whole bunch of girls, right? Something like how many girls are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chicks, right? 6 chicks. And Toots is like, dude, I could have taught him this whole thing by himself, right? Like the guy needs experience. I could have given him the experience, you know, but like at the end of the day, Mr. Corbeau's like, yeah, but like with 6 girls, he's going to get more experience, right? Because like 6 different styles. So it's like, okay. And then like Corbeau starts doing these things that are kind of questionable, but not terrible. I mean, he's using the Beyonder to produce like huge amounts of gold to intimidate opposition, different things like that. But then it's also stuff to like cure his son's dyslexia. And in probably one of the crappiest things, to make his wife look beautiful. I'm like, look, man, she's your wife. You're supposed to love her no matter what, right? So it's kind of like, all right. But at the end of the day, he also introduces him to the idea that just because you can use your powers doesn't necessarily mean you should. This really comes in the form of gambling. That for Corbeau, part of the fun is just seeing if he can actually win, right? Because the Beyonder uses his powers to ensure that the horse that Corbeau bet on actually does win. But it's one of these things where Corbeau's like, sometimes the fun of this is the luck of the draw, not knowing what's going to happen, right? Like that's part of the experience. That's part of the enjoyment. It's just sort of doing feeling things and kind of getting a feel for things. And so ultimately, after a passage of about a day or so, Corbeau's like, look, man, I can't teach you anything anymore. You got to get out there in the world and you got to make your own way. And so from there, the Beyonder starts going through all these different experiences. He ends up getting like this great big huge yacht. He's surrounded by all these different women and things like that. He basically ends up running up on the kingpin and it's just like, you and all the men around you work for me, and starts using his power to essentially dominate the wills of everybody around the world, and they all bend to what it is that he wants. Then it starts to extrapolate out. Well, if I can control the wills of people, then I can control the wills of matter. I can control the wills of molecules and subatomic matter and so on and so forth. There's nothing that I cannot do, right? So kind of coming to this rapid recollection that he can do pretty much anything he wants to. But the downside to this is that as this goes on, he begins to realize that with the wills of other people, by taking their will over, also comes a really kind of removal of individualism. What makes them unique, what makes them interesting, that begins to go away. And instead, he's surrounded by people where they're all like, yes, sir, I'll do whatever you want me to, sir. And that's boring, right? Nobody wants a yes man. Nobody wants anybody who will lick your boots. And so he ends up coming upon Toots, basically fixes her memory, removes the fact that he can control her mind. And then we learn that she basically found honest work, right? She kind of went forward and was like, hey, look, like, I have a job as a server, but I'm basically, doing my own thing now, right? I'm out there working and all that kind of good stuff. And it's cool. And so ultimately he ends up realizing the necessity and the value of individualism, and then ultimately casts aside his powers, right? Kind of allows people to control themselves yet again, allows people to sort of regain their own individualism and go from there. And so at that point, you end up jumping over to him, basically encountering this woman who's really kind of considered to be this not really a debutante, but exceedingly popular in terms of the role she plays in society, the socialite, strikingly beautiful, so on and so forth. And when they have this conversation, she's kind of like, you are fantastic, like you please me in ways that I never imagined before, and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of like he basically ends up spending the night with her and then just leaves, right? Now she's head over heels for this guy. And so he's kind of looking around at the world as it exists and says there's so much dissatisfaction in this life that people live. There's so much unhappiness here. Like people are looking to become something better. They're looking to belong somewhere, but at the same time, they're all individual. They all have their own distinct personalities and different things like that. This inevitably leads to clash. So it's just kind of analyzing all these different facets and all these different types of people and so on and so forth. And so ultimately ends up revisiting Owen Reese. And so what he asks Owen Reese here is, I desire love, right? I desire to understand what is love. Baby, don't hurt me. I desire to understand love. What is affection? I don't really understand this. And Owen Reese is kind of like, man, that's a tough one. I can't really explain love to you. All I can really tell you is that love is one of these things where you care about a person on a level that's far deeper than, I hope they're okay, right? It goes far deeper than that. It's one of these things where they accept you for who you are, you accept them for who they are. The two of you work to make the other better, but the more of it you give, the more of it you give back. It's a very difficult concept to explain love. Like, what's the definition of love? And you could probably find a Webster's definition, out there somewhere, but still, a person by person experience-based definition of love depends on who you're talking to. And so when he ends up traveling back to Sharon, this socialite, he ends up finding out that she basically offed herself, when the Beyonder took off, because she felt like she'd never be able to find anybody better than him. And so what he ends up doing is basically resurrecting her from the dead. And then in turn, and probably one of the crappiest things ever, like he's like, I brought you back to life. And she's like, oh my God, you came back to me. And he's like, yeah, but I want to find real love. Like, I don't want what you have, right? But like the only reason why you love me is because of how I make you feel, right? That's the only reason why you love me. You don't really love me. You love the way that I make you feel. I just happen to be a part of that. What I desire is a good woman. So like he shows her all these different women and men and is like, show me which one I should fall in love with. Which is really kind of crappy. Going to a person who's in love with you and saying, here are the people that I'm interested in. Which one do you think I should date, right? Like it's the friend zone basically. And so you get one of these interesting moments where he's kind of like, okay, so the person that I desire to be in love with is basically Alison Blair, Dazzler. And then he also comments, she may very well be one of the most powerful people to walk this world, which is an interesting thing, although we're never really given a full-on explanation why. Instead, what he does is he grabs Alison, he grabs Dazzler, snatches her away, and then basically starts taking her from place to place, kind of bounces her all over these different locations, trying to impress her, takes her out into space to different parts of the galaxy, all in a way to kind of demonstrate, here's how I feel about you, I really, really like you, and here's all these gifts and all that kind of stuff. The classic mistake, right? Like really showing more of what he can do as opposed to more of who he is. And so the result of that is she really kind of seems to reject him initially. And so he kind of begins to understand what it is that she's looking for, that she wants to understand who he is. And so he basically teleports the two of them to a mountaintop in Nepal. And they share this really, really intimate moment. And initially, Alison Blair is really kind of swept up by it. She's kind of like, wow, I mean, this guy's amazing. Like he's taking me everywhere and he's showing me all these different things and he's classy and kind and all that kind of stuff. And so he's sort of like, hey, look, I've got bands and I've got music and all kinds of things that you can use in order to keep yourself happy. I'll be right back. So he basically just kind of teleports away. He goes to Alpha Flight. I don't really know why. And like takes the bag of Shaman, which is like, he's this really crappy character. And like Frieza's daughter, which I don't know why it matters. Like nobody cares. Is Alpha Flight. So the result is that the really kind of the big takeaway takeaway from this is he takes a ring out of the bag and then basically ends up running back to Alison Blair with the intention to propose to her, or at least to present kind of a trinket, a sign of his affection. But ultimately, she ends up rejecting him. And the reason why is because, one, she doesn't really know him, and two, there doesn't really seem to be much to him. And that's kind of the big important takeaway from this, right? Like having substance, having something to offer, right? Because when it comes to relationships and it comes to courting people, it really is marketing 101. You have to find an answer to the question, why are you a person worth dating, right? Like being a man or a woman is not good enough, right? Like I'm a guy, that's why you should date me. It's like, no, that's not really good enough, right? Like that's not okay. Like be someone worth dating. And that's kind of where the Beyonder, that's kind of what he lacks, right? Because he seems to kind of lack that human component, that ability to understand and relate to people. And so because of that, of course, he's rejected by Alison Blair. And then in turn, he tries to sort of get her back. And then suddenly the Avengers appear out of nowhere. And when that happens, a fight breaks out between the Avengers and the Beyonder. And seemingly in the middle of all that, they kind of seem to get the upper hand. And then of course, Dazzler jumps in and is just kind of like, stop, right? Because the Beyonder is sort of controlling and keeping his powers under check, so he's not really using them to their fullest extent. But when he gets Alison Blair alone and takes her back to the Rock again, he basically says, I faked the whole thing, right? Like I faked the whole scenario so you would understand whether or not you truly care about me and you truly miss me, right? Like kind of force her hand, which is sometimes what you have to do. And then the result of that is that Alison Blair is kind of like, okay, let's see where this goes. And so what he does is he gives her cosmic awareness, and it's just way too much for her to be able to handle or to tolerate, right? When that happens, like she basically rejects him, right? And then she ends up kind of fleeing, ultimately falling down to the ground and dying. And the Beyonder resurrects her and then kind of puts her in a mindset to where he dominates her will and she's in love with him. But at the end of the day, he took her free will away. And so giving it back to her, it's just kind of like, this isn't going to work out, right? It's not something that can actually function here. Instead, she kind of walked away, rejected him, and that was essentially the end of that. And so following that, the Beyonder kind of goes about on his own thing, right? Kind of wandering around and sort of looking at his own life and so on and so forth. And it's really more of him just kind of pondering his existence, what he can and can't do, what he's capable of, coming to terms with everything that's happened so far. And so ultimately, he ends up coming across a young girl named Tabitha Smith, also known as Boom Boom. And this is Boom Boom's first appearance in Marvel Comics, for those of you guys who are curious. At the moment, she's like 13 years old. She's exceedingly young, but she also comes from a really, really abusive household. And so for those of you guys who are reading House and Powers of X, this is why Tabitha is so cynical about people, right? She has this conversation with the Beyonder where they're talking about the nature of friends, different things like that. And she holds a very nihilistic view, right? In the sense that it's basically meaningless, right? That friends, no matter what level they are, if they stay with you long enough, they'll eventually leave, right? Like any friend, like if you have a friend that doesn't leave you for the rest of their life, then they simply just didn't live long enough, right? That's kind of her really cynical and nihilistic view on friendship. And the Beyonder rejects it. And this is important because the Beyonder is not really in a position where it's just kind of like people are nice and they do great things and all that kind of stuff. But he's not really super cynical either, but he's also not naive. He is to a degree, but he's gained a lot of experience over time. And so he understands the difference between a truth and a lie, and what things can really be like and how people perceive things and so on and so forth. And so as a result of that, he actually takes off to his own Beyond realm and really just sort of hangs out there and muses about altering the universe and really even creating like his own facsimile of Alison Blair inside his Beyondverse. But ultimately, it's just not good enough, right? Like it's not really the same as actually having Dazzler, the woman who can choose who she wants to be with, and having her choose him, right? Like there's a kind of pride that comes with that, right? A kind of satisfaction that comes with that, and that's what he desires. He's kind of beginning to sort of home in and hit on this idea of desire. And so following that, he ends up grabbing a car, coming across Tabitha Smith again, and then takes her to Westchester because she was on her way to try to find the quote-unquote fictional X-Men school that she wasn't really sure if it actually existed or not. But as soon as she arrives there, she says, like literally Rachel Summers freaks out and she's like, it's the Beyonder, get him! And like they all immediately run up on him and start attacking him. And so the Beyonder just ends up fleeing, right? He just ends up peeling off in a car. Now again, the Beyonder could have destroyed them with less than a thought, right? Just a wave of his hand and that would have been the end of them. Remember, the Beyonder is really wanting to understand humanity. And because humanity is for the most part powerless, he wants to either bring himself down to their level or at the very least, go without his powers in any real sense and just kind of experience what it means to live. And so the result is that Tabitha Smith is actually crushed by the idea that the Beyonder really kind of abandoned her, right? It's kind of this continuation of this ideology that people will always abandon you. This and the fact that the X-Men were nothing like what she thought they were kind of leaves her in a relatively hopeless state. And so she kind of calls out to the Beyonder and she's like, look, come back. If you don't come back, I'm going to set off one of my bombs and I'm going to blow myself up, which is kind of crazy. And of course the Beyonder shows up, before it goes off. He's like, you're insanely annoying. She's like, well, I'm 13 years old. What kind of comes with the package? And I was like, look, man, if that's what she was willing to do at 13 years old, maybe you should have left her, maybe let that run its natural course. But from there, what he ends up doing is basically saying like, I'm tired of this world and there's people on it, right? Almost kind of like this Dr. Manhattan sort of scenario. The motivations are different, but he basically says, we're going to leave this world. And instead, we're going to go to the world complex, which is basically the headquarters of the Celestials. And this is when you start getting into the idea of the cosmic entities. And so when he shows up here, because of the fact that the Celestials really kind of chill, right? Because when you're a Celestial, like when you're a being as old as they are, and you'll be there until the end of the universe, the entire lifespan of humanity happens like that, right? It happens in the blink of an eye. And so for them, like they may commit a series of acts and it happens one after the other, after the other, after the other, at an exceedingly fast rate, in the same way that you wave your hand and you tap your foot. But for people who were looking at them, it takes eons for those things to happen, right? Because they perceive time differently than the Celestials do, and so on and so forth. And so because the Celestials are usually just kind of sitting around and chilling and whatnot, there's been this great big huge tourist trap, more or less, has been constructed around them that people go and they spend money at, and so on and so forth. But what the Beyonder really hits at here is he starts talking to Tabitha about his role in the cosmos. And he says, ever since he showed up here, all the cosmic entities have been in panic mode. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond to him, right? Because they can't destroy him. All they can do is try to figure out what steps they need to take. And that's what all the cosmic entities are doing. Galactus is doing that. Eon is doing that. Eternity is doing that. But all the cosmic entities are panicking, and they're all trying to figure out what they're going to do about the Beyonder. And so to really kind of instigate a scenario to show what the Celestials are capable of, the fact that they actually do things, the Beyonder basically shows up and says, if you guys don't come up here and stop me, I'm going to wipe out the entirety of the universe. And when the Celestials go to make their move, he simply just bats them away with a wave of his hand, and that's really kind of the end of them. Of course, everything comes crashing down. Tabitha Smith is horrified of him, and of course, he basically ends up taking her back to back to Earth. But following that, the Beyonder has this sort of conflict with the Avengers, right? When Tabitha comes back and tells the Avengers, hey, look, the Beyonder's here, and like things I think are going to pop off, the Avengers respond, and the Beyonder basically kind of ceases the conflict, and then basically starts walking off. And the big question is, what basically happens with the Beyonder now, right? Like understanding his place in the cosmos, understanding the full totality of what he's capable of and what he can do. This turns into the question, what will the Beyonder do next? And that's where the story begins to get cool, right? This whole first half is just things happening. They're not really that interesting. The second half is when you get to like all the cosmic entities getting involved, and like all the cosmic entities going to Owen Reese and me like, you're the only one who can stop him, and all that kind of cool stuff. So all the cool aspects of like the Beyonder versus the Molecule Man, that all happens in the second part of the story. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. Okay, I want to give a shout out to Kyle B, David Joseph, Ben, John H, AJ, Matt N, Jeff R, John H, Lean and Mean, which is an awesome name, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, Joey M, Steven Z, Austin B, Adam K, and Genosis 916. Remember, guys, you can send me messages and I'll run off whatever your message is at the end of the video, so long as there's nothing crazy. But if you want to put a message in there, send me an email, rob@robertjefferson.com. And if you are one of these people who gets shout outs, then I will tack it in there. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys.